Joining me now on Trade in the Economy, which is my number one favorite topic to talk about when you get 4.1 growth, Liz Peek. She is a columnist for the newspaper The Hill. I was just talking up The Hill in the former segment, one of my favorite sites and newspapers in D.C., my go-to place. And now that Liz Peek is there, The Hill's always been good. Now it's even better. Liz, good to have you.
Good morning. Glad to be joining you.
We want to get to trade and your column, but let's start with the economy. 4.1% GDP growth, exceeding all expectations. Remember, Liz, it wasn't so long ago. It wasn't so long ago that Obama administration officials were telling us that the new world order was we were going to get 1% growth. That was the new U.S. economy. Deal with it. Now we're getting over 4% growth. What happened?
Well, that's a good question. They actually had sort of buried into this whole narrative that we were, as a country and an economy, sort of doomed to secular stagnation was what it was called. And really, I think it was because they needed an explanation for why the economy only grew a little over 1% for most of Obama's presidency. And yes, to your point, that has changed pretty dramatically, really ever since Trump was elected. And I think there are three things. One is cuts. There's no question that's gasoline on a fire, and it definitely promoted spending by businesses. That's one of the sectors that just was absolutely dormant under Obama and now has come back to life. Growing 8.8% in the first quarter, and I think it's 5.6% in the second quarter. And secondly, obviously, the deregulation. I think one of the reasons that businesses weren't investing under Obama is they just were always afraid that some big new rule was going to be handed down from on high that would really stifle their business prospects. So the Trump agenda of lower taxes, deregulation, clearly is very important. But I think the X factor, the thing that Democrats really can't get their arms around even now, is that even in the weeks after Trump was elected, you had this enormous surge in consumer confidence and business confidence. That is something Democrats just constantly underrate. And I was talking to someone the other day who, this is sort of a stupid data point, but had been thinking about buying new golf clubs for like 5 years. And finally he went out and bought them. It's not like all of a sudden he had a huge raise. He just felt better about everything. And I think if you look, John, one of the most amazing statistics to me, and again, something Democrats have no answer for, if you look at Gallup's polling on direction of the country, the most recent reading is the highest it's been in 12 years. In other words, even with all the resistance, all the demonstrations out there, all the protests, all the anti-Trump hatred, Americans feel better about where we're headed than they did any single month under Obama. And I think that's an astonishing just sort of, verification that all of these elements have come together and the country is feeling upbeat.
So when you say that it's a 14-year high and people feeling that the country is moving in the right direction, you want to elaborate on that, Liz Peek?
Well, it's pretty easy to understand why. If you are looking for a job, there has not been a better time, certainly in 10 years, to get a job. More job openings than people looking for jobs for the first time in the country's history. And, what's interesting to me is Democrats are out there, like Menendez, I think, after about 4 or 5 days ago, was talking about how we have to create an economy that's working for everybody, not just the wealthy and big corporations. Have is an economy that's working for everybody because anybody can get a job now. That's the miracle of growth, is that felons, for example, who obviously have a hard time getting a job after they get out of prison, they are now in demand. The disabled has the lowest unemployment number ever. And, of course, you've heard from President Trump. Blacks, Hispanics, everybody is really looking at very, very low unemployment. And in the last month, we had 600,000 people come off the sidelines and go and get a job. Why? Because the jobs are there. Wages are beginning to move up gradually, admittedly, but they are moving up a little bit. so people feel optimistic about their own prospects. They think the country is doing better. And I'd say the other thing, there was always an overhang of the housing crash. People felt like they couldn't sell their houses. Well, now that's just not an issue. I mean, in fact, we have a shortage of housing today. And so on almost every economic metric, every personal metric, except maybe healthcare, John, I'd say that Americans are feeling much more upbeat than they have in years, literally years.
Well, also, and I'm glad you mentioned that the people that have come out of prison who are former felons have the highest employment now ever.
Yeah.
And that was a real problem. That's part of the record recidivism that we have. Felons come out, they can't get a job in a tight job market. What happens? They fall back into something bad, and they end up back where they were. A disaster for U.S. And so that's changed. The other thing is, I was reading this the other day, coming up here on the train, was that the number of people, the majority of these 600,000 people that came off the sidelines, you know what sidelined them? Right? You're going to find this
disability, I presume.
No, bad credit.
Oh, bad
from the
credit.
recession.
That's interesting. Yeah,
bad
that's
credit.
interesting.
They were saying that 70% of the 600,000 people who came off the sidelines that abandoned looking for a job that last month came back into the job market were driven out by bad credit. So what happened is, you know, when the recession hit and they lost their house or they got foreclosed on or their car got repoed, whatever, they lost their job, their credit went in the tank. And then in a tight job market where you got, 10 people applying for one opening, remember, back then, your credit score all of a sudden came into play.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that's a very good
people
point.
People forget that. I have friends of mine that, like, they would go and apply for a job. They were tremendously qualified, but their credit score was in the tank, and so they were cut out because you had so many applicants. That was the thing that they could just say, well, this person makes bad decisions, whatever, they're out. Now they're coming back. You look at this economy, and I think to myself, how do the Democrats take the House with this?
Well, they will only by vilifying Trump. But here's an interesting thing. What Democrats have come around to in the last 3 or 4 weeks, because of internal polling, I think they realize that their anti-hatred and yelling and screaming really isn't getting them very far. And, of course, most Americans really are focused on the economy and how they're doing economically. So, in fact, Democrats recently rolled out another economic agenda. Steny Hoyer, the number 2 Democrat in the House, published something that actually was an agenda conceived of 8 years ago, but they've kind of brushed it up and modernized it, and this is now their newest economic plan that are supposed to guide their people who are campaigning for House seats. And honestly, I would feel so frustrated if I were Steny Hoyer, because some of these ideas are good ideas. They have all been preempted by President Trump. One of the biggest ones, and I want to talk about why this has come up, is training workers. Obviously, we're looking at a worker shortage in this country right now, or at least that's the current theme. People are having a hard time, and I think it's true, employers are having a hard time hiring people. So, the idea is, since Democrats can't admit this, but since our public schools are failing to educate kids so that they're job ready, now, that's a big push. The Democrats want to offer apprenticeships and so forth. Well, what did Trump do just, 3 or 4 weeks ago? He rolled out a big new apprenticeship program, which I think gets pretty high marks. So at every turn of the road, Trump is like one step ahead of them. But the interesting thing to me, and you probably have seen this, I had not until yesterday, one of the reasons that Democrats are so focused on jobs and training and so forth is that internal polling by a group called Third Way, which is a left-leaning organization, shows that Democrats, Americans in general, are not interested in income inequality. That's just not the policies they're really eager to embrace. Instead, what they want to talk about is opportunity. And this really should make us all feel very optimistic about this country. People really don't want all of their future provided for them by the government. What they want is the opportunity to do it themselves. And I think Democrats, that's just not their pitch. I mean, you talk about all the sort of socialist blabber that's coming out of Democrat candidates now. They don't really know what socialism is all about. What they think it's all about is simply giving away more goodies to people who need them. Well, for people who really are in need, yes, we do need to provide help. But for most Americans, they don't want handouts. They really do want an opportunity to make it on their own. And I think that's very bullish. I think it's very bullish, frankly, for Republicans, because that's the language we speak. It is not the language that Democrats speak.
So the new plan by Steny Hoyer and the Democrats, at least they have a plan now, right?
Yeah.
They haven't had one up till he came out with it. Is there anything in there that you think might resonate with the electorate between now and November 6th?
Well, they can talk about infrastructure, because let's face it, the Trump administration has not. When was the last time you heard from Elaine Chao? It's been a while, right? Mm-hmm. So we have not really gotten anywhere on infrastructure. I think that Trump's program is exactly right, which has to do with streamlining the permitting and the sort of legal entanglements that have held up infrastructure in great parts of the country, certainly California and some of the other blue states. And I also think the use of private money, these public-private partnerships, a very good idea, because the federal government doesn't have a lot of money to put into this right now. And, lest people think, well, this is just another way to sort of siphon money out of the economy into rich pockets or whatever. Note that the Europeans are way ahead of us on using these so-called PPIs, public-private partnerships, and that tells you it's not a big handout to the rich, because the Europeans are way left of the United States. Anyway, we haven't gotten very far. If I were the Democrats, I would talk about infrastructure. Voters probably won't demand to know where the money is going to come from, and they can make a case that the Trump administration has promised a lot here and not delivered. But truthfully, if I were a Democrat running for office, I would really focus on health care, because that is still one of the top issues for most Americans. And I think it's, very complicated to explain why the Obamacare was failing and is still failing, and how it is that Republicans want to make it better. Republicans, I think, have done a completely miserable job of messaging their program on health care, partly because it's scattershot. Nobody kind of agrees on what to do. And there's been backing and forthing. We took the money, the Trump administration took the money away from insurance companies. Now they're putting it back there again. People really don't know what to make of that. And I think the GOP really has to get their message straight on this.
Well, there is no message on health care right now.
Isn't.
I would agree with that. And certainly infrastructure, I think that whole of everything the Trump administration has done, you look at the repeal and replace, the Republicans never really had a plan. The president thought they did, so that was a disaster. But the infrastructure rollout at Trump Tower, which became Charlottesville, was probably the worst rollout of anything they've ever had. Even when they tried to roll it out after Charlottesville, I remember reading it like 5 times. I could not understand it. And I mean, I'm trained to understand this stuff. I couldn't figure it out. I just could never figure out where the money was coming from. And I said to myself, you know what? If I can't figure this out after 5 times, they'll never be able to sell it to anybody, because it's too complicated. And it was a disaster. I mean, he's got to get back to that, because that was one of the cornerstones of his campaign, was reinvest in our infrastructure. John Fredericks Radio Network. Want to thank Liz Peek for being with us today. Hey, Liz, always good to have you. Follow her at Liz Peek. You can also read her columns in The Hill newspaper. Liz, just go to The Hill, Liz Peek, or go to lizpeek.com. Liz, thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.